Stone does not forget. In the half-buried remains of ancient settlements scattered across deserts, river valleys, and collapsed cities, there are places that feel different from everything around them. Not temples, not homes, not workshops. These spaces are narrower, heavier, and unnaturally quiet. They are often discovered late in excavations, mistaken at first for storage rooms or defensive cells, until the details begin to accumulate iron fittings set too low in the walls. Grooves worn into stone floors where something was dragged repeatedly. Small recessed chambers with no ventilation and no clear purpose for daily life. Archaeologists rarely announce these spaces with certainty. Instead, they pause. Measurements are taken again. Sketches are redrawn. The language becomes cautious, almost restrained. What emerges slowly is a pattern that spans civilizations separated by oceans and centuries. Different cultures, different languages, different beliefs. Yet similar architectural decisions appear again and again, confined spaces designed not for living, but for containment, restraint, and suffering. These are the chambers of ancient pain, thus though no ancient builder would have described them so simply. The past does not preserve intentions easily, it preserves structure, and structure, in this case, is revealing enough. Deep within the ruins of early fortified settlements, particularly those dating back to the earliest organised states, there are rooms that seem deliberately hidden from public view. Some are accessed through narrow stairways descending below street level. Others are tucked behind administrative halls or temple complexes, as if violence was not separate from governance, but embedded within it. The stone surfaces often show signs of repeated moisture, sometimes from flooding, sometimes from neglect, sometimes from the absence of light and air circulation over long periods of use. In these spaces, the human imagination struggles to remain abstract. Before going deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes these chambers so unsettling is not only their existence, but their consistency across time. In Mesopotamian city-states, small enclosed cells appear beneath administrative buildings. In later Roman provincial sites, similar confined rooms are discovered near judicial complexes. In medieval fortifications, underground spaces emerge that appear to have been modified repeatedly, as if their purpose evolved over generations of institutional use. Even in regions with entirely different cultural frameworks, the same basic architectural logic repeats isolation from the public eye, controlled access, and an environment designed to reduce autonomy. It is easy to assume that these were simply prisons in the modern sense, but the archaeological record suggests something more complex. Many of these chambers are too small for long-term habitation, too poorly ventilated for sustained occupancy, and too deliberately structured for mere detention. They seem designed for moments of transition rather than permanent confinement, interrogation, punishment, ritualized correction, or in some cases, a combination of all three. The difficulty in interpreting these spaces lies in the silence of written records. Ancient texts often describe laws in detail, but are far less precise when describing their enforcement. Legal codes survive carved into stone and clay, but the lived experience of punishment is rarely recorded in full. When it is mentioned, it appears in formal language, stripped of physical detail, as if the system itself demanded distance between description and experience. Yet the architecture fills that gap. In one excavated complex from the ancient Near East, a sequence of rooms reveals a progression, an entrance hall with administrative markings, a narrow corridor that reduces in width as it descends, and finally a sealed chamber with a single anchored fixture in the centre. The fixture itself is ambiguous in purpose. Some interpret it as a restraint point, others suggest storage, but where patterns in the surrounding stone suggest repeated use involving pressure, binding, or stationary positioning of human bodies over time, no decorative elements exist. No comfort is provided. The space is purely functional in the most severe sense of the word. Elsewhere, in early Egyptian administrative sites, similar subterranean chambers appear near storage and record-keeping areas. Egypt is often remembered for monumental architecture and symbolic burial practices, yet its administrative backbone also contained mechanisms of discipline. The evidence is subtle but persistent isolated rooms, sealed access points, and architectural segregation from ceremonial or residential zones. These spaces rarely appear in isolation. They exist as part of broader bureaucratic systems designed to maintain order across large populations. What becomes increasingly clear is that punishment in the ancient world was not an external function of society. It was internal to its structure. Civilization, in its earliest forms, required coordination on a scale previously unseen in human history. Agriculture, taxation, labour organisation, and territorial defence all demanded compliance. And compliance, when not voluntary, required enforcement. The chambers discovered by archaeologists are physical remnants of that enforcement. But there is another layer that complicates interpretation further. In many sites, evidence suggests that these spaces were not used continuously. Instead, they show cycles of activity followed by abandonment, then reused centuries later. This pattern implies not just institutional necessity, but shifting cultural attitudes toward punishment itself. At times, such spaces may have been active instruments of state power. At other times, they may have been sealed, forgotten, or repurposed as political or religious ideas changed. No single explanation fully accounts for this irregularity. In some regions, later civilizations appear to build over earlier punitive structures without fully erasing them. In others, older chambers are incorporated into new systems of governance. suggesting continuity of practice rather than replacement. The result is a layered archaeological record where violence is not a singular invention, but an evolving tradition embedded within the foundations of governance. What is often missing from the discussion is the sensory reality of these spaces, not in graphic detail, but in environmental terms: the absence of light, the controlled restriction of sound, the thickness of stone that prevents external noise from entering. These are design choices that shape perception as much as physical confinement does. They create environments where time itself becomes difficult to measure, where orientation is lost, and where human presence is reduced to minimal interaction with the surrounding world. Such conditions are not accidental. They reflect a sophisticated understanding of how environment influences behaviour. Even without written explanation, the architecture communicates intent, and intent, in this context, appears to revolve around control. As excavations continue across different regions, researchers increasingly recognise that these chambers are not anomalies. They are part of a broader pattern in which early civilizations developed parallel systems of administration and coercion. The same societies that built irrigation networks, trade routes, and legal codes also built spaces designed to isolate and discipline the human body under controlled conditions. The contradiction is not easily resolved. Civilization is often described as a progression toward order, stability, and refinement. Yet within its earliest layers, order and coercion are deeply intertwined. The chambers of ancient pain stand as physical evidence of that relationship, preserved not in written ideology but in stone, soil, and silence. And as more of these spaces are uncovered, one question begins to emerge more clearly than the rest: whether these systems were created as temporary solutions to instability, or whether they were always intended to become permanent features of organised society. The answer does not lie in any single site. It lies in the accumulation of many, and in that accumulation, a pattern begins to form, one that will shape every system of justice that follows. Long before stone chambers were built beneath cities, punishment already existed in a far less structured form, scattered across early human groups as fragmented acts of retaliation, warning, and survival. In the absence of centralised authority, justice was immediate, personal, and often inseparable from emotion. A theft might be answered with expulsion. A betrayal might lead to violence that left no record except memory. In these early societies, punishment was not a system, it was a reaction. But as human groups grew larger and more stable, something began to change in the way conflict was handled. Once communities reached a certain scale, personal retaliation became dangerous to collective survival. Endless cycles of revenge could fracture cooperation, disrupt food production, and weaken defence against external threats. Stability required restraint, and restraint required rules that extended beyond individual judgment. This is where punishment begins its transformation from impulse into structure. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that early forms of social regulation were likely informal at first, based on elders, consensus, or spiritual authority. Decisions were still human, but they were increasingly framed as collective rather than personal. Over time, these decisions hardened into repeated patterns. Certain actions consistently led to certain consequences, and when repetition becomes predictable, it begins to resemble law. No written code is required for this shift, only memory and consistency. In small agricultural settlements, where cooperation determined survival, the need for predictable consequences became even more important. Irrigation systems had to be maintained collectively, harvests had to be protected from theft, labour had to be coordinated across seasons. In such environments, disruption was not merely antisocial, it was existential. Communities began to develop shared expectations about acceptable behaviour, and violations of those expectations demanded response. At first, these responses were likely simple: exclusion from the group, loss of shared resources, public shaming, but even these early forms carried psychological weight. To be excluded from a small community in a harsh environment could be as severe as physical harm. And over time, these social mechanisms laid the groundwork for more formalised systems of punishment. The transition from informal punishment to institutional control does not happen suddenly. It emerges gradually, as leadership roles become more defined and authority becomes more centralised. As settlements grow into towns, and towns into cities, the distance between decision-makers and the general population increases. This distance allows for the development of standardised rules, enforced not by personal relationships, but by designated authority. At this stage, punishment begins to detach from emotion and attach to governance. The earliest known legal codes reflect this shift clearly. They do not simply describe forbidden actions, they define consequences in structured, often proportional terms. The language is precise, repetitive, and impersonal. This is not accidental. The act of writing laws itself requires abstraction. It transforms lived experience into symbolic instruction. Yet even in these early codes, punishment remains deeply physical. Harm is still answered with harm. The logic is not rehabilitation, but balance. If a person causes injury, injury is returned. If a person disrupts order, order is restored through force. The underlying assumption is that social equilibrium can be maintained through mirrored consequence. This idea is most clearly visible in some of the earliest recorded legal traditions, where penalties are explicitly tied to bodily harm or loss of freedom. But what is less often considered is how these written laws would have been enforced in practice. Texts describe outcomes, but rarely describe methods. Between law and execution lies a space that is almost never documented directly. It is in that space that physical systems of punishment emerge. As settlements evolve into complex city-states, enforcement becomes a logistical problem. Authority must be visible enough to deter, yet controlled enough to avoid constant chaos. This creates a need for designated locations where punishment can be carried out away from the general flow of daily life, not hidden completely, but separated, not secret, but contained. This is where architecture begins to reflect ideology. In early Mesopotamian societies, for example, administrative buildings often serve multiple functions. They are centres of record-keeping, taxation, and judgment. Within or beneath these structures, smaller spaces appear that are not designed for public gathering or commerce. These are controlled environments where authority becomes physically enacted. The separation between judgment and punishment becomes spatial. A decision is made above ground, often in a public or semi-public setting. The consequences of that decision are carried out elsewhere, in controlled chambers or enclosed spaces. This separation allows authority to maintain legitimacy while still exercising force. It creates distance between law and its physical impact. This pattern repeats across multiple early civilizations. In Egypt, administrative and judicial authority is closely tied to centralized power. The state presents itself as an extension of cosmic order, where disruption is not only social but metaphysical. Punishment, therefore, is framed as restoration rather than revenge. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that enforcement still required physical spaces where individuals were isolated, restrained, or controlled under authority. These spaces rarely survive in monumental form. They are often small, unadorned, and located in areas of administrative activity rather than ceremonial architecture. Their simplicity is part of their function. They are not meant to inspire, but to regulate. In early Greek city-states, the diversity of political systems leads to variation in punitive practice. Some regions emphasize civic participation, where penalties are tied to public accountability. Others rely more heavily on centralized enforcement. Philosophical texts from later periods reflect ongoing debates about justice, suffering, and the purpose of punishment, suggesting that even in antiquity, these systems were not universally accepted or uniformly applied. But across all these regions, one pattern remains consistent: punishment becomes increasingly organized as societies become more complex. The more structured a civilization becomes, the more structured its methods of control must be. This is not simply a matter of cruelty or morality. It is a matter of scale. Large populations require systems that function without constant negotiation, and systems that function without negotiation require enforcement mechanisms that are predictable, repeatable, and administratively manageable. Over time, this leads to specialization. Individuals or groups become responsible for enforcement. Spaces are designated for detention. Procedures become standardized. What was once an immediate reaction becomes a managed process. And as processes become institutionalized, they begin to develop their own internal logic, separate from the original emotional or social motivations that created them. This is where punishment begins to acquire a life of its own. Archaeological traces of early enforcement spaces show signs of repeated modification. Walls are reinforced, entrances are narrowed, access points are controlled. These changes suggest not only use, but adaptation. Systems are refined over time to increase efficiency, control movement, and reduce resistance. In some cases, these spaces are found adjacent to administrative records, suggesting that documentation and enforcement evolve together. The written word and the physical chamber become parallel instruments of governance. Yet despite this increasing formalization, ambiguity remains. It is often unclear how frequently these systems were used, or how consistently they were applied. Some regions show evidence of centralized control, while others suggest more fragmented or localized enforcement. This variation indicates that early punishment systems were not uniform across cultures, but adapted to specific social, environmental, and political conditions. What unites them is not method, but function. They all serve to regulate behavior within growing populations. And as populations continue to grow, so too does the need for stronger, more visible forms of deterrence. This sets the stage for a new development in the history of punishment, the shift from private enforcement to public demonstration. The idea that punishment is not only a corrective measure, but a signal directed at the wider population. That shift will redefine how power is expressed and how fear is maintained within society. Because once punishment becomes visible, it no longer belongs only to the individual who experiences it. It belongs to everyone who witnesses it. The moment punishment becomes visible, it changes its purpose. What once existed as a controlled response to individual transgression begins to function as a message directed at the entire community. In early societies where oral communication dominated and literacy was limited to small administrative elites, visibility carried enormous weight. People learned not only from rules, but from what they saw happening to others. A single public act of punishment could shape behavior across an entire settlement more effectively than written instruction. This is where legal codes and lived reality begin to diverge in a meaningful way. Written laws describe order, public punishment enforces it. The gap between the two is where authority learns how to shape perception. In the earliest stages of organized civilization, punishment was still relatively contained, often carried out near administrative centers or within restricted civic spaces. But as cities grew larger and populations became more diverse, rulers faced a new problem: distance. Authority could no longer rely on personal familiarity or small-scale social pressure. It needed methods that could operate across anonymity. Visibility solved that problem. Public punishment transforms private enforcement into collective instruction. The individual becomes secondary to the audience. The act itself becomes a demonstration of consequence rather than a resolution of conflict. In this way, punishment begins to function less like a legal outcome and more like a social performance. Archaeological and historical records from multiple early civilizations suggest that designated spaces for public punishment were often carefully chosen. Open squares near administrative buildings, marketplaces, and crossroads became ideal locations. These were places where movement naturally concentrated, where people gathered for trade, communication, and ritual life. By placing punishment within these environments, authority ensured maximum exposure without requiring forced attendance. The design of these spaces was not accidental. In some cases, elevated platforms or stepped architecture allowed visibility from multiple angles. In others, boundaries were subtly shaped to control crowd movement and maintain order during public events. Even without advanced engineering, the spatial arrangement reveals intent to ensure that what happened in these moments could not be easily ignored. The psychological impact of such events should not be underestimated. For individuals living in tightly interconnected communities, witnessing punishment was not a distant or abstract experience. It was immediate, embodied, and deeply memorable. The senses recorded everything: sound, movement, silence, afterward. These memories would circulate through conversation, becoming reinforced through repetition. In societies where oral transmission was dominant, this created a powerful feedback loop between event and narrative. Yet even as punishment becomes more public, it does not lose its administrative structure. Instead, it becomes more organized. In Mesopotamian city-states, for example, the administration of justice is closely tied to temple and palace authority. Punishment is not arbitrary, but framed within established legal traditions. The presence of law codes suggests an effort to standardize outcomes, even when their execution takes place in public view. This dual structure written law and public enforcement creates a balance between predictability and spectacle. Ancient Egypt presents a slightly different model. Here, the ideology of order is deeply embedded in the concept of cosmic balance. Punishment is framed not only as social correction, but as restoration of harmony within a larger metaphysical system. Even so, archaeological evidence suggests that enforcement still required physical spaces where authority was enacted upon individuals in controlled conditions. The ideological framing differs, but the structural necessity remains similar. In Greek city-states, especially in later classical periods, public accountability becomes a defining feature of civic identity. Legal disputes and penalties are often embedded within public life, reinforcing the idea that justice is not separate from citizenship. Philosophical debates from this era reveal growing tension between punishment as deterrence and punishment as moral instruction. Thinkers question whether suffering produces virtue or merely fear, but the systems themselves continue to operate. Across these cultures, one pattern remains consistent: the increasing integration of punishment into public space. However, visibility also introduces complexity. Once punishment is seen by many, it becomes subject to interpretation. Different observers may draw different conclusions. Some may see justice, others may see excess. Some may feel reinforced obedience. Others may experience fear or resentment. Authority cannot fully control interpretation, only the event itself. This creates an early form of tension between power and perception. In some cases, records suggest that public punishment was adjusted depending on social conditions. Periods of instability often correlate with increased visibility and severity of enforcement, while more stable periods sometimes show reduced emphasis on spectacle. This suggests that punishment was not static, but responsive to broader political and economic pressures. It is also in this period that specialization within enforcement systems becomes more apparent. Roles begin to separate more clearly those who judge, those who record, and those who carry out decisions. This division reduces ambiguity and responsibility and strengthens institutional continuity. It also distances decision-making from physical execution, reinforcing the abstraction of authority. At the same time, physical spaces continue to evolve. In some archaeological sites, structures associated with enforcement show signs of repeated expansion or modification. Simple enclosures become more complex over time. Access points are refined. Movement within these spaces becomes more controlled, even when located near public areas. Internal organizations suggest a growing concern with managing not just punishment itself, but the process surrounding it. What emerges is a layered system visible on the surface, structured beneath. But there is another dimension to consider, one that is less visible in the archaeological record but hinted at in written sources and later commentary: the role of expectation. Once public punishment becomes established, it begins to shape behavior even in its absence. The memory of past events, combined with the possibility of future enforcement, creates a constant background pressure within society. People regulate themselves not only based on law, but based on anticipated consequences. This internalization of authority is one of the most significant developments in early governance. Punishment no longer needs to occur frequently to remain effective. Its presence in collective memory is sufficient to influence behavior. In this way, visibility transforms into permanence. The act fades, but its effect remains. However, this system also carries inherent instability. As populations grow and diversify further, the relationship between authority and community becomes more complex. Different groups may interpret laws differently. Economic inequality can affect how punishment is perceived. Cultural variation introduces multiple value systems within the same political structure. What appears as order from one perspective may appear as imbalance from another. These tensions do not immediately dismantle systems of punishment, but they do influence their evolution. Over time, there is a gradual shift toward more formalized procedures. Written records become more detailed, legal processes become more standardized, enforcement becomes more bureaucratic. The goal is no longer only visibility, but consistency. Yet even as systems become more complex, the underlying principle remains unchanged: punishment as a mechanism for maintaining order through consequence. What began as isolated acts of retaliation has now become an integrated feature of civilization itself, embedded in law, architecture, and collective memory. And as societies continue to expand, this integration will only deepen, eventually leading to institutions where punishment is no longer occasional or situational, but continuous, systematic, and fully embedded within the machinery of governance. It is at this point that enforcement stops being an event and becomes a system. By the time the first recognizable city-states emerge in the ancient Near East, punishment is no longer an improvised response to disorder. It is embedded in the machinery of governance, shaped by bureaucracy, religion, and the practical demands of managing dense populations. What earlier societies treated as occasional necessity now becomes a structured expectation, tied directly to the stability of the state itself. Mesopotamia offers some of the clearest early evidence of this transformation. In cities built along the Tigris and Euphrates, life depends on coordination at an unprecedented scale. Irrigation canals must be maintained across communal land. Grain storage must be regulated, trade routes must remain secure, labour must be organised across seasons and social classes. In such an environment, disorder is not just inconvenient, it threatens survival. This pressure gives rise to increasingly formal systems of law and enforcement. Written legal codes appear as one of the most significant developments of this period. These codes do more than describe acceptable behaviour. They define consequences with precision, attempting to remove ambiguity from justice. Punishment becomes predictable, standardised, and tied to specific violations. This predictability is crucial for maintaining order in societies where personal relationships can no longer govern every interaction. But the written law is only one part of the system. Its enforcement requires physical infrastructure. Within administrative complexes, spaces begin to appear that are not dedicated to storage, worship, or residence. These are controlled environments where authority is enacted directly upon individuals who have violated social or legal expectations. The architecture of these spaces reflects their purpose in subtle but unmistakable ways: restricted access, narrow passageways, limited light, and separation from public circulation. These are not accidental design choices. They represent a deliberate effort to separate judgment from everyday life. In Mesopotamian culture, law is often intertwined with divine authority. Kings present themselves not as inventors of law, but as its appointed stewards. Justice is framed as an extension of cosmic order, sanctioned by higher powers. This ideological framework strengthens the legitimacy of punishment while also distancing it from personal vendetta. What is carried out is not revenge, but restoration of balance. Yet the physical reality of enforcement remains grounded in human bodies and controlled spaces. Archaeological evidence from administrative districts suggests that punishment was often carried out near centres of governance rather than in isolated locations. This proximity reinforces the connection between authority and consequence. Decisions made by officials are not abstract, their outcomes are immediately visible within the same institutional environment. Some of the most revealing sites show layered usage over time. Rooms initially constructed for administrative functions are later modified, subdivided, or reinforced in ways that suggest shifting roles. In certain cases, access becomes increasingly restricted, as if control over entry and exit becomes more important than the original purpose of the space. This evolution reflects a growing emphasis on containment and procedural control. Across the broader region, similar patterns appear in varying forms. In ancient Egypt, punishment is deeply connected to the concept of mat, the principle of cosmic balance. Disorder is not simply a social problem, but a disruption of universal harmony. Enforcement, therefore, is framed as restoration. Even so, administrative records and architectural remains indicate that physical enforcement mechanisms existed within state structures, often integrated into broader systems of governance rather than separated from them. Egyptian administrative centres reveal carefully organised spaces where authority is concentrated. Within these complexes, controlled environments suggest the presence of disciplinary practices that were part of maintaining bureaucratic stability. While monumental architecture tends to dominate modern perception of Egypt, it is the less visible administrative infrastructure that reveals how order was sustained on a daily level. In the Greek world, the situation becomes more fragmented due to the political structure of independent city-states. Each polis develops its own approach to law and enforcement. Some emphasize civic participation, where citizens are directly involved in legal processes. Others rely more heavily on appointed officials or institutional mechanisms. This diversity produces not only variation in punishment, but also intellectual reflection on its purpose. Philosophical traditions emerging in this period begin to question whether punishment is meant to correct behaviour, deter future violations, or express moral truth. These debates do not eliminate punishment, but they reveal growing awareness of its complexity. Even as systems become more structured, they are no longer accepted without scrutiny. Despite these differences across regions, a shared pattern remains visible. Punishment becomes increasingly bureaucratic. This shift is subtle but profound. Where earlier forms of enforcement may have relied on direct decision-making by local leaders or assemblies, later systems introduce layers of administration. Records are kept, procedures are followed, roles are assigned. Authority becomes distributed across multiple functions rather than concentrated in a single individual. This bureaucratization changes the nature of punishment itself. It becomes less dependent on personal judgment and more dependent on process. The system begins to operate with internal logic, where outcomes are determined not only by the nature of the offence but by the structure of the institution. As this happens, physical spaces evolve accordingly. Rooms associated with enforcement become more standardized in design, access is more tightly controlled, movement within these spaces becomes regulated by corridors, thresholds, and checkpoints. The architecture reflects the need for predictability and oversight. Even without advanced engineering, the spatial logic becomes increasingly sophisticated. In some sites, evidence suggests that administrative and enforcement areas are physically adjacent, reinforcing the connection between documentation and execution. Written records do not merely describe punishment, they help organize it. The act of recording becomes part of the enforcement process itself, yet this growing structure also introduces new vulnerabilities. As systems become more complex, they become more dependent on stability. Bureaucratic enforcement requires continuity of administration, reliable record-keeping, and consistent interpretation of law. Disruptions in any of these areas can lead to inconsistency or fragmentation of authority. Historical records from periods of political instability often show signs of this breakdown. Legal consistency weakens. Local authorities gain more discretion. Enforcement becomes uneven. The system does not disappear, but it becomes less predictable. This reveals an important truth about early punishment systems. They are not inherently stable. They require constant maintenance. Without administrative coherence, even the most formalized legal structures can revert to localized or ad hoc enforcement practices. The presence of law does not guarantee uniform application. The presence of authority does not guarantee consistency. What emerges from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece is not a single model of justice, but a shared trajectory from informal retaliation to structured enforcement, from personal judgment to institutional process, from isolated acts to integrated systems. And beneath all these changes, one underlying transformation continues to deepen. Punishment is no longer just a response to behavior. It becomes a tool for organizing society itself. As this idea takes root, it will shape not only how ancient civilizations function, but how later empires expand, consolidate, and maintain control across vast territories. Because once punishment becomes bureaucratic, it can scale, and once it can scale, it becomes something far more powerful than a reaction to disorder. It becomes a language of power that can be spoken across entire civilizations. Power does not remain still once it learns how to scale itself. In the ancient world, the moment punishment becomes bureaucratic and repeatable, it begins to detach from the small environments in which it first evolved. No longer confined to local disputes or city walls, enforcement expands outward with the same logic that drives empires to expand control must match the size of territory, and order must follow wherever authority extends. This expansion changes everything about how punishment is experienced, but also how it is designed. In earlier city-states, enforcement could still be relatively immediate. A local official, a council, a temple authority. These were close enough to the population that punishment retained a visible human face. But as political entities grow into regional powers and early empires, distance becomes the defining challenge. Authority is no longer present everywhere at once. It must be represented, delegated, and enforced through layers of administration. This is where punishment begins to transform into a system of governance rather than a local corrective mechanism. In Mesopotamian empires, especially during later periods of Akkadian and Babylonian rule, administrative records show increasing sophistication in how law is transmitted across territories. Governors are appointed to enforce centralized directives. Legal expectations are standardized so that outcomes remain consistent even far from the capital. What matters is no longer just the decision itself, but its reproducibility across space. Reproducibility requires structure. Structure requires procedure, and procedure requires enforcement mechanisms that can operate without constant oversight. This is where the architecture of punishment begins to evolve again, becoming more deliberately engineered for control rather than simply containment. Across excavated administrative complexes from imperial periods, archaeologists find evidence of increasingly specialized spaces. Some are designed for holding individuals temporarily under authority. Others appear to be used for interrogation or administrative processing. The organization of these spaces suggests that punishment is no longer a single event, but a sequence of controlled stages: detention, assessment, judgment, execution of consequence. Each stage requires its own environment. This segmentation reflects a deeper shift in how authority understands human behavior. Instead of reacting to isolated acts, imperial systems begin to categorize behavior into types, severity levels, and procedural pathways. This categorization allows punishment to be scaled across diverse populations with minimal deviation from central authority. In this sense, punishment becomes modular, and modular systems are what allow empires to function across vast territories. But as enforcement becomes more structured, it also becomes less visible in its full form to the general population. What is seen by ordinary people is often only the final stage consequence. The earlier stages, documentation, classification, decision-making, occur elsewhere, often within administrative spaces far removed from public view. This separation creates a psychological distance between action and authority. In earlier periods, punishment could be witnessed as a single coherent event tied directly to a decision-maker. In imperial systems, that clarity dissolves. The person who enforces is not necessarily the person who decides. The place where judgment occurs is not the same as where consequences are carried out. Authority becomes distributed across space and roles. This distribution increases efficiency, but reduces transparency. In regions influenced by Roman administrative organisation later in antiquity, this trend becomes even more pronounced. While Rome is often remembered for its monumental engineering and public spectacles, its governance structure relies heavily on procedural consistency. Law is codified, transmitted, and applied across provinces with increasing emphasis on standardisation. Within this framework, punishment becomes part of a broader administrative language that includes taxation, military discipline, and civic regulation. Enforcement is not an isolated function. It is one component of a wider system designed to maintain imperial cohesion, yet even within such systems, local variation persists. Distance from central authority inevitably produces differences in interpretation and execution. Provincial administrators may apply rules differently depending on local conditions, resources, or political pressures. This variability means that while punishment is standardized in theory, in practice it remains flexible at the edges. Archaeological evidence reflects this tension. In some provinces, enforcement spaces appear highly organized and consistent in design. In others, they are improvised within existing structures, adapted from older buildings or modified over time. This suggests that imperial systems often operated through adaptation rather than uniform construction. Still, the direction of change remains clear. Punishment is becoming less about individual judgment and more about systemic management. In parallel with this administrative evolution, there is also a shift in the emotional distance between authority and consequence. Earlier forms of punishment, even when structured, often carried direct human visibility. In imperial systems, layers of administration reduce that immediacy. Decisions are abstracted through records, officials, and procedures before they reach physical enforcement. This abstraction has profound consequences for how authority is experienced. For those who administer the system, punishment becomes procedural rather than personal. For those subject to it, the system becomes larger, less visible, and more difficult to interpret as a whole. Authority becomes something that is felt, but not always seen in its entirety. This imbalance reinforces the perception of inevitability. One of the most significant developments in imperial enforcement systems is the increasing reliance on documentation. Written records are not simply archival tools, they are instruments of governance. They ensure continuity across time, standardise decisions, and provide a framework for accountability within the system itself. But they also contribute to the distance between action and consequence. A written entry may determine a physical outcome far removed in space and time from where it was created. This separation further transforms punishment into an administrative process rather than a direct social interaction. Within this context, physical spaces associated with enforcement continue to evolve. They become more segmented, more controlled, and more integrated into administrative networks. Movement within these spaces is carefully managed. Access is restricted not only by physical barriers, but by procedural authorization. The architecture begins to reflect hierarchy in increasingly precise ways. Different spaces correspond to different levels of authority. Certain areas are accessible only to specific roles within the system. This spatial hierarchy mirrors the administrative hierarchy, reinforcing the structure of governance through physical design. What emerges is a fully integrated system in which law, administration, and physical enforcement are interdependent. Yet despite this complexity, the fundamental principle remains unchanged from earlier periods. Order is maintained through consequence. What has changed is scale, structure, and abstraction. And with that abstraction comes a growing distance between the human experience of punishment and the systems that produce it. In earlier societies, punishment was immediate and local. In imperial systems, it becomes procedural and distributed. In both cases, it serves the same function, but the experience of it becomes fundamentally different depending on one's position within the system. At the highest levels, it is logic. At the lowest, it is reality. And between those 2 points lies the entire machinery of empire. As this machinery continues to expand, it will eventually reach a point where physical enforcement alone is no longer sufficient to maintain control. New methods will emerge that do not rely solely on visible consequence, but on internalized expectation, psychological conditioning, and sustained uncertainty. Because once a system becomes large enough, it no longer needs to act constantly to remain powerful. It only needs to be believed. Control does not always require contact. By the time ancient societies mature into expansive political systems, a quieter form of punishment begins to emerge alongside physical enforcement. It does not replace earlier methods. Instead, it grows within them, like a second layer of structure that is harder to see but easier to maintain over distance. This is the gradual rise of psychological pressure as a governing force. In earlier periods, authority depended heavily on visible consequence, a body punished, a space restricted, a rule enforced, enforced in direct and observable ways. But as populations increase and territories stretch across mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas, visibility becomes less reliable. People cannot witness enforcement everywhere at once. They begin to rely instead on what they are told, what they hear, and what they assume. This is where punishment begins to shift inward. Fear, anticipation, and uncertainty become tools of governance just as much as physical restraint. The knowledge that punishment exists becomes more important than witnessing it directly. In this way, authority extends beyond architecture and into perception. Ancient administrative systems begin to recognize this power implicitly. Even without formal psychological theory, rulers and officials understand that uncertainty can regulate behavior as effectively as direct force. A law does not need to be enforced constantly to influence conduct. It only needs to be believed as consistently enforceable. This creates a system in which absence can be as powerful as presence. In Mesopotamian and later imperial records, there are subtle indications of this shift. Legal texts become increasingly detailed, not only in describing offences and penalties, but in emphasising inevitability. The language of law often reinforces certainty, consequences follow violations, the system responds, order is restored. This repetition is not accidental. It is designed to reinforce internal compliance before external enforcement is even necessary. In practice, this means that many forms of control are never physically enacted at all. The structure of belief does much of the work. At the same time, administrative systems continue to refine the visible side of punishment. Public enforcement remains important, but it becomes more strategic. Rather than frequent application, it is often reserved for moments of heightened tension or symbolic demonstration. These moments reinforce the credibility of the system as a whole. The result is a dual structure. One layer is visible, physical, and occasional. The other is continuous, invisible, and psychological. In ancient Egypt, this duality is closely tied to the concept of cosmic order. Authority is not merely political but metaphysical. Disruption is not just illegal, but unnatural. Within this worldview, the fear of disorder carries as much weight as the experience of punishment itself. The maintenance of harmony becomes an internalized expectation reinforced through ritual, administration, and social structure. In Greek city-states, particularly during periods of philosophical development, there is growing awareness of the internal dimensions of behavior. Thinkers begin to explore the relationship between fear, virtue, and self-regulation. While these discussions are philosophical rather than administrative, they reflect a broader cultural recognition that control does not rely solely on external force. Across these civilizations, a shared pattern becomes visible as systems become more complex. They rely less on constant enforcement and more on sustained expectation. This does not eliminate physical punishment. Instead, it embeds it within a larger framework of psychological influence. Archaeological evidence alone cannot fully capture this dimension, but it can hint at its presence. For example, the placement of enforcement spaces within administrative centres suggests intentional proximity between authority and awareness. Even when not in use, these spaces remain part of the spatial experience of governance. Their presence alone communicates possibility. In some regions, the architecture of authority itself becomes symbolic rather than purely functional. Large gates, elevated platforms, and controlled access points serve not only practical purposes, but also psychological ones. They reinforce hierarchy through spatial experience, reminding individuals of their position within a structured system. Over time, this leads to a form of behavioral adaptation. People begin to regulate their actions not only based on direct experience of punishment, but based on perceived likelihood. Social behavior becomes shaped by anticipation. The system does not need to act frequently, because its potential action is always present in collective awareness. This is one of the most efficient forms of control developed in the ancient world. However, it is also one of the least stable. Because psychological systems depend heavily on belief, they are vulnerable to shifts in perception. If authority appears inconsistent, weak, or divided, the effect diminishes rapidly. If enforcement fails to occur when expected, confidence in the system can erode. This fragility creates pressure to maintain not only actual control, but perceived control. In imperial contexts, this often leads to cycles of reinforcement. Periodic displays of authority are used to restore confidence in the system. These are not necessarily frequent, but they are highly visible when they occur. Their purpose is not only to enforce rules, but to reset perception. This dynamic creates an ongoing tension between economy and display. Too much enforcement strains resources, too little weakens authority. The balance between these extremes becomes a defining challenge for large-scale governance. Within this framework, psychological control becomes increasingly central. Even administrative language reflects this shift. Records emphasize consistency, inevitability, and order. The repetition of a legal certainty reinforces behavioral expectations across populations that may never directly interact with central authority. At the same time, the internalization of control begins to shape individual behavior in more subtle ways. People adjust not only to laws, but to imagined consequences. The mind becomes a site of governance as much as the physical world. This does not mean that fear is the only mechanism at work. Social cohesion, cultural norms, religious beliefs, and economic dependency all contribute to behavioral regulation. But within the context of punishment systems, psychological expectation plays a distinct and powerful role. By the time later empires refine their administrative structures, this internal dimension of control is fully integrated into governance. enforcement is no longer only something that happens to people, it is something that people carry with them in anticipation. This marks a significant transformation in the history of punishment. What began as a physical response to disorder has evolved into a layered system, part architecture, part administration, part psychology. Each layer reinforces the others, creating a structure that extends beyond individual acts into continuous social influence. And yet, despite this complexity, the system remains grounded in the same fundamental principles seen in the earlier societies. Behavior is shaped through consequence. Only now, consequence does not always need to arrive. Its possibility is enough. As these systems continue to develop, they will eventually produce new forms of enforcement that do not rely on visible punishment at all, but instead on classification, documentation, and internal regulation of identity itself. Because once control enters the mind, the boundaries between law and perception begin to blur. And at that point, punishment is no longer just an action. It becomes a condition of awareness. At the edges of expanding empires, punishment begins to change its shape again, not in its purpose, which remains the maintenance of order, but in its method, which becomes increasingly tied to systems of infrastructure, engineering, and large-scale organization. As states grow more powerful, they no longer rely only on immediate enforcement or psychological expectation. They begin to embed control directly into the physical environment itself. Nowhere is this more visible than in the Roman world, where punishment becomes part of a broader technological and administrative landscape. Rome does not invent punishment, but it refines its structure with an intensity that earlier civilizations rarely match. What distinguishes Roman systems is not simply severity, but organization. The empire spans vast territories, diverse populations, and varied local traditions. To manage this scale, Rome develops a governance model where law, infrastructure, and enforcement operate as interconnected components of the same system. Punishment, in this context, becomes engineered. Roman legal traditions emphasize codification and consistency. Laws are written, revised, and transmitted across provinces with increasing precision. This creates a shared framework that can be applied far from the center of power. But the written law is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a network of institutions responsible for interpretation, enforcement, and execution. These institutions rely heavily on physical spaces designed for control. Urban centers across the empire contain administrative complexes where judicial decisions are processed. Within or near these spaces, facilities exist for holding individuals under authority. These environments are not uniform, but they share common architectural principles: separation from public circulation, controlled access points, and spatial arrangements that prioritize containment and movement regulation. What is particularly significant in the Roman context is the integration of these spaces into the urban fabric itself. Punishment is not hidden at the margins of society, it is embedded within it. This embedding serves multiple functions. It ensures efficiency, reduces the need for long-distance transfer of individuals under authority, and reinforces the presence of law within everyday life. The city becomes not only a place of residence and commerce, but also a visible structure of governance where authority is continuously present in spatial form. At the same time, Rome develops a parallel dimension of punishment that is highly visible and performative. Public executions and disciplinary displays are used strategically as demonstrations of imperial authority. These events are not random acts of violence. They are carefully situated within social and political contexts where visibility amplifies their impact. Amphitheatres, public squares, and major thoroughfares become stages where the consequences of disobedience are made observable to large audiences. The psychological effect of such events is cumulative. They reinforce the perception that law is not abstract, but immediate. They also connect imperial authority directly to the bodies of those who violate its rules. In this way, punishment becomes both administrative and symbolic. Yet Roman systems are also highly procedural. Despite their reputation for spectacle, enforcement operates through structured legal processes that involve documentation, hierarchy, and formal decision-making. This dual-nature procedural governance combined with public demonstration creates a system that is both stable and adaptable. One of the most important features of Roman enforcement is its reliance on engineering. Infrastructure is not separate from control. It is part of it. Road networks allow rapid movement of officials, information, and military forces. Aqueducts and urban planning reflect centralized coordination. Fortified boundaries and controlled entry points regulate movement across regions. Even architectural design within cities reflects hierarchy and order. Within this framework, punishment becomes spatially distributed but conceptually unified. Different provinces may apply enforcement locally, but all operate within the same legal framework. This allows Rome to maintain cohesion across vast distances without requiring constant direct intervention from the centre. However, this system also depends heavily on consistency. As long as procedures are followed and authority is recognised, the system functions smoothly, but variation in local conditions can introduce differences in application. Distance, communication delays, and regional autonomy all contribute to subtle divergence in enforcement practices. Archaeological evidence from provincial sites reflects this variation clearly. Some regions show highly standardized administrative structures, while others reveal adaptation to local traditions and existing institutions. In many cases, Roman enforcement systems are layered over earlier cultural frameworks rather than replacing them entirely. This layering produces hybrid systems of governance. What remains consistent is the underlying principle: punishment is not isolated, but integrated into a broader administrative order. In some cases, evidence suggests that enforcement facilities are located near administrative centres, reinforcing the connection between decision-making and execution. In others, they are embedded within military structures, reflecting the role of the army in maintaining imperial stability. The military dimension is particularly important. In frontier regions, discipline and control are essential for maintaining order among both soldiers and local populations. Enforcement in these contexts often overlaps with military hierarchy. Creating systems where punishment serves both civilian and strategic purposes, this blending of civil and military authority further extends the reach of punishment as a governance tool. At the same time, Roman intellectual traditions begin to reflect on law in more systematic ways. Legal scholars analyze principles of justice, proportionality, and procedural consistency. While these discussions do not eliminate punitive systems, they contribute to their refinement. Law becomes increasingly conceptualized as an ordered system rather than a collection of isolated decisions. This intellectualization of law reinforces bureaucratic control. As legal reasoning becomes more structured, so too does enforcement. Decisions are justified through reference to precedent, procedure, and codified principle. This reduces arbitrariness and increases predictability across the empire. Yet even within this highly organized system, punishment retains its fundamental role as a mechanism of control. What changes is not its purpose, but its scale and integration. By embedding punishment within infrastructure, administration, and military organization, Rome creates a system in which enforcement is not a separate function of the state, but a continuous expression of it. Authority is no longer something that acts occasionally. It is something that is always present, distributed through roads, laws, buildings, and procedures, and within that presence, punishment becomes less of an isolated event and more of a structural condition of imperial life. A system this integrated does not rely on constant action to maintain itself. It relies on continuity, and continuity, once established, becomes its own form of power. There are moments in ancient cities when punishment stops feeling like a hidden mechanism of governance and becomes something closer to a shared experience of order itself. Not because people understand every detail of the system behind it, but because they can see its effects unfold in public space, shaping behaviour in real time. In these moments, punishment is no longer confined to chambers, records, or administrative decisions. It becomes visible as performance, designed not only to enforce law but to communicate power. This is where spectacle enters the history of punishment. In the Roman world, this transformation reaches a particularly structured form. Public spaces such as amphitheatres and large civic arenas are not only centres of entertainment, but also instruments of authority. They concentrate attention, gather crowds, and create environments where collective observation becomes part of the enforcement process. The design of these spaces is critical. Tiered seating ensures visibility from multiple angles. Controlled entry points manage crowd flow. Central arenas isolate events from the surrounding city, while still keeping them fully exposed to public view. Architecture and authority converge in a single function to ensure that what happens inside cannot be ignored outside. But spectacle punishment is not uniquely Roman. Earlier civilizations already understood the value of visibility. What Rome refines is scale, repetition, and integration into civic life. Public enforcement becomes part of the rhythm of the city, embedded within festivals, judicial cycles, and administrative routines. The effect of this visibility is not simply fear, it is memory. When large groups witness enforcement together, the event does not remain isolated. It circulates through conversation, repetition, and retelling. Over time, the original event becomes part of a broader narrative that shapes how communities understand authority. The system no longer relies only on those who directly experience punishment. It relies on those who have heard about it. This creates a form of distributed influence. Even individuals who have never witnessed enforcement directly still adjust their behaviour based on its perceived presence. In this way, spectacle extends the reach of punishment far beyond the physical boundaries of any single event. However, spectacle also introduces tension into the system. Because when punishment is made visible, it becomes open to interpretation. Different observers react differently depending on social position, personal experience, and cultural context. What reinforces authority for some may generate discomfort or resistance in others. This variability means that spectacle is powerful, but not entirely controllable. Ancient administrators appear to have understood this balance intuitively. Records suggest that public enforcement was often used selectively rather than constantly. Too frequent, and it risks diminishing impact. Too rare, and it loses credibility. The effectiveness of spectacle depends on timing, context, and perceived inevitability. This careful calibration reveals a sophisticated understanding of collective psychology, even without formal theoretical language. At the same time, punishment continues to exist outside of spectacle, within quieter administrative systems that operate continuously but invisibly. These systems handle documentation, classification, and procedural enforcement. While less visible, they are often more important for the long-term stability of governance. The coexistence of spectacle and bureaucracy creates a dual structure. One layer communicates power outwardly, the other sustains it internally. In many cases, the two layers reinforce each other. Public events validate the seriousness of written law, while written law gives structure and legitimacy to public events. Together, they form a self-supporting system of authority. Yet the balance between these layers is never perfectly stable. Periods of political stress often see increased reliance on spectacle, as visibility is used to reinforce weakened authority. Conversely, stable periods may emphasize bureaucratic consistency over public display. This fluctuation suggests that punishment systems adapt dynamically to broader conditions of governance. Beyond Rome, similar patterns appear in other imperial contexts. In parts of Asia under large dynastic rule, public enforcement and bureaucratic regulation also coexist, though with different cultural framing. In some cases, emphasis is placed more heavily on administrative precision than public demonstration. In others, ritualized visibility plays a larger role in reinforcing hierarchy and order. Despite these differences, the underlying principle remains consistent. Punishment operates across multiple layers of society simultaneously. What makes spectacle particularly significant is its ability to compress complex systems of authority into a single moment of observation. In a brief period of time, observers witness the outcome of laws, procedures, and administrative decisions that may have taken weeks or months to process. The complexity of the system is reduced into a visible endpoint. This compression strengthens the perception of inevitability. However, archaeological evidence also suggests that not all enforcement was public. Many punitive processes occurred in administrative or controlled environments with no broader audience. These spaces, often located within larger governance complexes, handle the majority of enforcement activity in relative isolation. This distinction is important. Spectacle represents only a small visible fraction of a much larger system. The majority of enforcement operates through routine, documentation, and procedural execution. Without these underlying structures, public punishment would not be sustainable. In some excavated sites, spatial organization reflects this division clearly. Public-facing areas are separated from internal administrative zones. Movement between them is controlled through restricted access points. This reinforces the distinction between what is shown and what is managed. Over time, this separation becomes more pronounced. Authority becomes layered not only in function but in visibility. Certain aspects of governance are meant to be seen, while others are intentionally obscured. This creates a system in which understanding power fully requires access to multiple levels of structure, not just its public expression. Within this framework, punishment functions as both message and mechanism. As message, it communicates consequences to a wide audience. As mechanism, it maintains internal order through continuous administrative processes. Neither layer is sufficient on its own. Together, they form a system capable of operating across large and complex societies. But even this system has limits. Because spectacle depends on attention, and attention can shift. Over time, repeated exposure may reduce impact. Societies evolve, values change, and interpretations of authority shift with them. What once reinforces order may eventually require adjustment or replacement. This is one of the recurring dynamics in the history of punishment that need to constantly recalibrate between visibility and effectiveness. As empires continue to develop, they begin to rely more heavily on internalized systems of control, while gradually reducing reliance on frequent public enforcement. The spectacle remains, but its role becomes more symbolic than operational, and in that transition, punishment begins to move further away from physical space and closer toward institutional structure alone, a structure that does not always need to act, because its presence is already understood. When authority becomes large enough, it no longer relies on constant visibility to remain present. Instead, it embeds itself into procedure. In the medieval world that follows the collapse and transformation of earlier empires, punishment does not disappear or weaken. It reorganizes. Power becomes more fragmented across feudal systems, religious institutions, and emerging monarchies, but the logic of enforcement remains deeply intact. What changes is not the existence of punishment, but the way it is accessed and justified. In this period, interrogation becomes one of the central points where punishment and administration intersect. Unlike earlier public spectacle systems that emphasized collective witnessing, medieval enforcement often shifts toward controlled environments, where outcomes are determined through structured questioning, documentation, and procedural escalation. These environments are smaller, more enclosed, and more deliberately removed from public space. Architecture reflects this shift clearly. Spaces associated with interrogation or judgment are often located within fortified structures, castles, monastic complexes, or administrative buildings. Access is restricted through layered corridors, guarded entry points, and internal divisions that separate officials from outsiders. The design prioritizes containment not only of individuals but of information, because in these systems, information itself becomes a form of control. What a person knows, admits, or denies can determine their classification within the legal structure. The act of extracting information becomes part of enforcement, not separate from it. This integration marks a significant evolution in how punishment is applied. Unlike spectacle-based systems, where punishment communicates primarily to an audience, interrogation-based systems operate in partial visibility. Only fragments are exposed to the outside world. The majority of the process remains hidden within institutional walls. This concealment is not accidental. It reflects a growing emphasis on procedural legitimacy. Authority increasingly presents itself not through visible force alone, but through adherence to structured process. Decisions are framed as outcomes of rules, not individual will. Yet within these processes, coercion remains present. Historical records and architectural remains from various medieval regions suggest that enforcement spaces were designed to isolate individuals from external reference points. Light, sound, and spatial orientation are often restricted. The goal is not only physical containment, but psychological dislocation. In such environments, time becomes less stable, and communication becomes controlled through asymmetry of power. However, it is important to recognize that medieval systems are not uniform. Across different regions, enforcement practices vary significantly depending on legal tradition, religious influence, and political organization. Some areas emphasize formal legal proceedings with structured documentation. Others rely more heavily on localized authority and customary practice. This diversity makes it difficult to describe medieval punishment as a single system. What unites these variations is the increasing role of institutions in mediating conflict. Whether through secular courts, religious authorities, or feudal lords, punishment becomes increasingly embedded in institutional frameworks rather than direct personal action. This institutionalization reduces arbitrariness while increasing procedural complexity. In religious contexts, particularly within organized ecclesiastical systems, enforcement takes on additional layers of ideological framing. Deviations from accepted belief systems are treated not only as legal issues, but as matters of doctrinal order. This expands the scope of punishment beyond physical actions into the realm of thought and belief. The result is a system where boundaries between legal, moral, and spiritual authority become intertwined. At the same time, record-keeping becomes more sophisticated. Written documentation plays a central role in maintaining consistency across cases. This includes recording accusations, testimonies, decisions, and outcomes. The written word becomes a stabilizing force, ensuring that decisions can be referenced, replicated, and justified within institutional frameworks. This reliance on documentation further distances punishment from immediate experience. Where earlier systems relied on public observation or direct enforcement, medieval systems increasingly rely on recorded processes that may be reviewed, interpreted, or extended over time. This introduces temporal distance into the structure of punishment itself. A decision is no longer only an event, it becomes a record. Within fortified complexes, enforcement spaces evolve accordingly. Chambers are divided, corridors are structured for controlled movement, and access points are carefully regulated. The architecture reflects a balance between security, procedure, and institutional hierarchy. Some spaces are designed for initial assessment, others for confinement, others still for formal decision-making. Each stage is separated physically, reinforcing procedural separation as well as social hierarchy. This segmentation of space mirrors the segmentation of authority. No single individual controls the entire process. Instead, responsibility is distributed across roles. This reduces personal accountability while increasing systemic stability. It also reinforces the perception that punishment is the result of structure rather than individual discretion. However, this diffusion of responsibility can also obscure the experience of enforcement itself. For those subject to the system, the complexity of institutional structure can make it difficult to understand where decisions originate or how they are produced. This opacity becomes part of the system's strength, because when processes are difficult to fully observe, they become harder to challenge directly. Yet even in this period of institutional consolidation, traces of older forms of punishment remain. Public displays, although less central than in earlier eras, still appear in certain contexts. These moments serve symbolic functions, reinforcing authority when needed, particularly during periods of instability or transition. This reveals an important continuity across historical periods. Punishment rarely exists in a single form. Instead, it accumulates layers over time. New systems do not fully replace older ones. They incorporate, modify, or coexist with them depending on circumstance. As medieval systems mature, they lay the groundwork for even more structured forms of governance that emerge later. Administrative precision increases, legal frameworks expand, institutional authority becomes more centralized, and beneath all of this, the same fundamental logic persists. Order is maintained through consequence, but the nature of consequence continues to shift, becoming less visible, more procedural, and increasingly embedded in systems that operate beyond the immediate perception of those affected. In this transformation, punishment moves further away from spectacle and closer to structure itself, a structure that does not always need to reveal its full operation in order to function, because by this stage, authority is no longer defined only by what it does. It is defined by how completely it organizes what can be done. By the time punishment becomes fully institutionalized within medieval systems, it no longer depends on a single center of authority. Instead, it spreads across overlapping jurisdictions, each with its own procedures, priorities, and mechanisms of enforcement. Religious courts, royal administrations, local lords, and urban councils all participate in shaping how consequence is defined and applied. This fragmentation does not weaken punishment, it multiplies it. Because in a distributed system of authority, control no longer relies on uniformity, it relies on reach. Different institutions may apply different procedures, but the underlying assumption remains shared behavior must be regulated through structured consequence, even if the pathways vary. Within this complex landscape, interrogation-based systems of enforcement reach their most refined form. Unlike earlier public or spectacle-based models, Medieval interrogation systems operate primarily through controlled environments designed to manage both information and behaviour. These are not spaces of open visibility, but of selective disclosure. What is revealed is carefully shaped by process, timing, and authority. Architecture plays a central role in this system. Enforcement spaces are often located deep within fortified structures, away from public circulation. Movement through these environments is controlled through sequential passageways, each stage reducing external reference points. This spatial narrowing is not incidental. It reflects an understanding that environment influences perception, memory, and decision-making. Light, sound, and orientation are carefully managed. Thick stone walls reduce external noise, narrow corridors limit visibility, doors and thresholds create pauses in movement, breaking continuity between spaces. The result is an environment where experience becomes segmented, reinforcing procedural control. In such systems, punishment is not a single moment but a process distributed across time and space. This process typically involves several stages: initial accusation, documentation, assessment, interrogation, and final judgment. Each stage is handled by different roles within the institutional hierarchy. This separation ensures that no single individual controls the entire sequence, reinforcing the perception of procedural objectivity. Yet this objectivity is structural rather than neutral. It is produced through design. Medieval legal traditions, particularly in regions influenced by both secular and religious authority, increasingly emphasize the importance of formal procedure. Written records become essential. Testimonies are recorded, stored, and referenced. Decisions are justified through accumulated documentation rather than immediate observation. This reliance on documentation fundamentally changes the relationship between authority and time. In earlier systems, punishment was often immediate or closely tied to public events. In institutional systems, it becomes delayed, processed, and extended. Time itself becomes part of enforcement. Waiting becomes a component of consequence. This temporal extension has psychological effects that are difficult to separate from physical enforcement. Uncertainty becomes sustained. Outcomes are not always immediate or predictable. The period between accusation and resolution becomes part of the experience of control. In some cases, this delay reinforces compliance more effectively than immediate punishment would. Across different regions, variations of these systems develop distinct characteristics. In some areas, religious authority plays a dominant role, embedding enforcement within doctrinal frameworks. In others, secular administrations take precedence, emphasizing procedural consistency and legal codification. Often, both systems coexist and overlap, creating complex jurisdictional landscapes. Despite these differences, the underlying logic remains consistent. Punishment is increasingly mediated through institutions rather than direct personal authority. This mediation introduces distance between decision and experience. For those administering the system, punishment becomes an abstract process governed by rules and documentation. For those subject to it, the system appears larger, more opaque, and less directly accountable. This asymmetry is one of the defining features of institutional punishment systems. At the same time, there is evidence that enforcement spaces continue to evolve in response to administrative needs. Some are expanded to accommodate procedural stages. Others are subdivided to increase control over movement and access. In certain cases, older structures are repurposed and adapted rather than replaced entirely. This adaptive reuse reflects a broader pattern in medieval infrastructure continuity through modification rather than reconstruction. Within fortified complexes, spatial hierarchy becomes increasingly important. Different rooms and corridors correspond to different levels of authority. Access is restricted not only physically but institutionally. Movement through space often requires authorization, reflecting the broader hierarchy of the governing system. This spatial organization mirrors bureaucratic structure. Authority is no longer centralized in a single figure, but distributed across roles and functions. Judges, administrators, scribes, and enforcers each occupy distinct positions within the system. This division increases efficiency and scalability, but also diffuses responsibility. The effect is a system in which punishment is produced collectively rather than individually. This collective production reinforces institutional stability, but makes the system itself less transparent. No single point of origin exists for many enforcement decisions. Instead, outcomes emerge from procedural interaction between multiple components. As these systems mature, they begin to define not only punishment but legitimacy itself. Authority is increasingly validated through adherence to procedure. A decision is considered valid not because of who makes it, but because of how it is made. This shift has long-term consequences, because once legitimacy is tied to process rather than person, systems can persist even as individuals change. Institutions outlast their participants, procedures outlast their origins, and in this endurance, punishment becomes self-sustaining. It no longer depends on immediate political will or direct enforcement alone. It is embedded within the structure of governance itself. At this stage, punishment is no longer simply an instrument of power. It becomes part of the architecture of authority, a structure that continues to operate through time, adapting to new conditions while preserving its core logic of consequence. And as this architecture becomes more complex, it lays the foundation for even more centralized and standardized systems that will emerge in later periods of history. As medieval systems evolve into more centralized forms of governance, punishment begins to align itself with the logic of expanding state power rather than fragmented institutional authority. What was once distributed across overlapping jurisdictions slowly starts to consolidate into more unified structures, especially in regions where monarchies strengthen and administrative control becomes more coherent. This shift does not eliminate older systems of enforcement. Instead, it reorganises them under broader frameworks that attempt to standardise law, procedure, and consequence across larger territories. The result is not simplification, but alignment. In this context, punishment becomes increasingly bureaucratic in a more modern sense of the term. Where earlier medieval systems relied on a mixture of local custom, religious authority, and feudal obligation, emerging centralised states begin to emphasise codified law and consistent application. This creates pressure for uniformity, even in regions with deeply varied cultural and legal traditions. To achieve this, governance relies heavily on written codes, official documentation, and trained administrators who can interpret and apply law in standardised ways. Punishment becomes less dependent on individual discretion and more dependent on institutional procedure. This does not mean arbitrariness disappears. Rather, it becomes embedded within structured frameworks that give it the appearance of consistency. One of the most significant developments during this period is the increasing importance of legal categorization. Actions are defined more precisely, and corresponding consequences are mapped with greater specificity. This allows authorities to manage larger populations without relying on case-by-case negotiation. As a result, punishment becomes more predictable in form, even if not always in outcome. The spaces associated with enforcement also reflect this transformation. Older medieval structures are often adapted or replaced by more standardized facilities designed to accommodate administrative efficiency. These spaces are increasingly integrated into formal governance complexes, reflecting the centralization of authority. Movement within these environments becomes highly regulated. Access is controlled through procedural authorization, and internal organization reflects hierarchical distinctions between roles and responsibilities. Even without modern engineering, spatial design begins to reflect systemic logic. In some regions, enforcement spaces are located near courts or administrative centers, reinforcing the connection between judgment and execution. In others, they are positioned within fortified structures that serve both political and military function. This variation reflects differing paths towards centralization, but the underlying trend remains consistent. Punishment is becoming more uniformly administered across broader geographic areas. At the same time, documentation becomes even more critical. Written records now serve not only as evidence of decisions, but as mechanisms for ensuring continuity across time and administrative turnover. Laws are preserved, revised, and transmitted through official channels, creating a stable framework that outlasts individual rulers. This emphasis on continuity strengthens institutional authority. Because when systems persist beyond the individuals who create them, they acquire a form of structural permanence that reinforces their legitimacy. Within this evolving framework, enforcement increasingly relies on delegation. Local officials act on behalf of central authority, applying standardized rules within their jurisdictions. This delegation allows states to extend control over vast territories without direct intervention in every case. However, delegation also introduces variation. Differences in interpretation, local conditions, and administrative capacity can lead to uneven application of punishment. Central authorities often respond by increasing oversight mechanisms, issuing clearer guidelines, and refining procedural rules. This ongoing adjustment reflects a constant tension within centralized systems, the need to balance uniformity with practical flexibility. Despite these challenges, the direction of development remains clear. Punishment becomes more systematically embedded within state structures, less dependent on localized authority, and more reliant on formalized procedure. In parallel, intellectual traditions begin to engage more deeply with questions of law and governance. Legal scholars and administrative thinkers analyze the relationship between justice, order, and authority. While their perspectives vary, they contribute to a growing sense that law is not merely a tool of enforcement, but a system that requires coherence and rational structure. This intellectualization reinforces bureaucratic development. As legal reasoning becomes more formalized, punishment is increasingly justified through reference to principle, precedent, and codified authority. This reduces the role of personal judgment in favor of procedural consistency. Yet even as systems become more rationalized, they remain deeply rooted in earlier traditions of control. The underlying logic of consequence persists, even as its expression becomes more structured. In many cases, older punitive practices are not entirely removed but gradually absorbed into new systems in modified form. This creates layers of continuity that stretch across centuries of institutional evolution. The result is a complex inheritance of enforcement practices, where older forms of punishment coexist with newer administrative mechanisms. This layered structure can still be observed in surviving architectural and documentary records. Older enforcement spaces are repurposed or incorporated into newer administrative complexes. Legal codes reference earlier traditions while introducing new classifications. Institutional memory becomes embedded within governance itself. Over time, this produces a system in which punishment is no longer simply an action carried out by authority, but a function distributed across multiple levels of administration, documentation, and spatial organization. It is at this stage that punishment becomes fully integrated into the machinery of the state, not as an occasional response to disorder, but as a continuous structural component of governance. a component that operates through law, procedure, and institutional continuity, and one that, once established, becomes extremely difficult to separate from the broader identity of the civilization that produces it. Because at this point, punishment is no longer just something societies do, it is something they are organized around. When punishment becomes fully embedded within the structure of the state, it no longer depends on dramatic expression or visible enforcement to maintain its influence. Instead, it operates through systems that are increasingly internal, procedural, and psychological in effect, even when they remain physically grounded in architecture and law. In the transition from medieval governance into more centralized early modern systems, a critical shift occurs. Punishment begins to extend beyond the body and into behavior itself. This does not mean physical enforcement disappears. Rather, it becomes one component in a much broader framework of regulation. States begin to focus not only on acts that violate law, but on patterns of behavior that suggest potential disruption. In this way, governance becomes anticipatory rather than purely reactive. This anticipatory logic requires more detailed classification systems. Authorities increasingly categorize individuals according to status, occupation, location, and perceived reliability within the social order. These categories are not neutral descriptors. They influence how law is applied, how closely individuals are monitored, and how consequences are determined. The result is a system in which identity becomes partially administrative. This development is closely tied to the expansion of record-keeping practices. Written documentation grows more sophisticated and more comprehensive. Populations are increasingly described, tracked, and organized through administrative records that allow states to manage complexity at scale. Punishment, in this context, becomes less about isolated events and more about maintaining the integrity of these classifications. If a classification is violated, the system responds. This introduces a new dimension to enforcement correction of deviation within structured identity frameworks. In earlier systems, punishment responded primarily to specific actions. In this emerging framework, it also responds to the relationship between individuals and the categories assigned to them by the state. This shift increases the reach of governance significantly, because it allows authority to operate not only after actions occur, but in anticipation of how individuals might act within defined parameters. At the same time, physical enforcement spaces continue to evolve. In many regions, older medieval structures are replaced or reorganized into more standardized administrative complexes. These spaces are designed for efficiency, segmentation, and controlled movement through procedural stages. However, the most significant transformation is not purely architectural, it is organizational. Authority becomes increasingly distributed across specialized institutions. Judicial functions, administrative classification, enforcement execution, and record management are handled by distinct roles operating within a unified system. This specialization allows governance to scale further, while also reducing reliance on individual decision-making. In this structure, punishment becomes the output of coordinated processes rather than singular judgments. Yet this coordination also introduces distance between decision and consequence. For individuals subject to the system, punishment may appear as the result of an impersonal chain of procedures rather than a direct act of authority. This perception reinforces the sense that the system operates independently of any single actor. This is a crucial development in the evolution of governance. Because once systems are perceived as self-operating, their authority becomes more difficult to challenge or isolate. Across early modern states, legal codification continues to expand. Laws are increasingly organized into comprehensive systems that attempt to account for a wide range of behaviors and circumstances. This codification reduces ambiguity, but it also increases the density of regulation. More aspects of life become subject to formal classification. This expansion does not necessarily increase visible punishment. In many cases, it reduces the need for frequent physical enforcement by increasing the presence of regulation in everyday behavior. The system operates more through structure than through action. At the same time, administrative oversight becomes more continuous. Records are updated regularly, populations are monitored through indirect mechanisms such as taxation, registration, and institutional affiliation. These systems allow authorities to maintain awareness of social conditions without constant direct intervention. Punishment in this environment becomes more preventive than reactive. Instead of responding only to violations, systems aim to reduce the likelihood of violations occurring in the first place. This changes the temporal orientation of governance. The future becomes a site of regulation as much as the present. This shift has profound implications for how authority is experienced. From the perspective of individuals, governance is no longer something encountered only during moments of conflict or violation. It becomes a continuous background structure that shapes behavior through expectation, classification, and procedural constraint. Even in the absence of visible enforcement, the system remains active through documentation, categorization, and administrative presence. This creates a form of distributed control that does not require constant physical expression to remain effective. In many regions, older punitive practices are gradually reduced in frequency, but not entirely eliminated. Instead, they are reserved for specific circumstances, often symbolic or exceptional in nature. This allows states to maintain the capacity for visible enforcement, while relying primarily on structural regulation. The balance between visibility and abstraction continues to shift. Over time, abstraction becomes dominant. Punishment becomes less about dramatic enforcement, and more about integration into systems of governance that operate continuously across time and space. This is one of the defining characteristics of mature state systems, the ability to regulate behaviour without constant visible intervention. But this efficiency comes with a trade-off. As systems become more abstract, they also become more difficult to perceive as unified wholes. Their complexity increases, and their operations become distributed across multiple institutions and layers of documentation. For those within the system, understanding how outcomes are produced becomes increasingly challenging. Authority is no longer located in a single place. It is distributed across processes, and within those processes, punishment is no longer a singular act. It is a function of structure itself, a function that continues to evolve as states become more complex, more bureaucratic, and more reliant on systems that operate independently of individual awareness. At this stage, punishment is no longer something that is simply carried out. It is something that is built into how society continuously organises itself. As punishment becomes increasingly embedded in administrative systems, its most important transformation is no longer visible in architecture or public enforcement, but in the way knowledge itself is used as a tool of control. What begins to emerge across late medieval and early modern societies is a growing reliance on documentation not only as a record of punishment, but as a mechanism that shapes how punishment is possible in the first place. In earlier periods, authority acted primarily on events. A violation occurred, a judgment was made, and a consequence followed. But as states expand their administrative reach, they begin to act on records of people as much as on people themselves. Identity becomes something constructed through written classification, stored in archives, and continuously updated through institutional interaction. This shift transforms punishment into something that is no longer only reactive or even preventive, but structural at the level of information. The rise of bureaucratic record-keeping allows authorities to maintain continuous visibility over populations that are too large and too dispersed to observe directly. Tax registers, legal archives, property records, and civic documentation create a parallel layer of reality in which individuals exist as entries within systems. These entries carry implications, obligations, restrictions, privileges, and potential penalties. In this environment, punishment begins to operate through correction of recorded status as much as through physical consequence. If a record is altered, incomplete, or marked as violation, that classification itself becomes the trigger for enforcement. The act of punishment is no longer always initiated by immediate human observation of wrongdoing, but by discrepancies within the system of documentation. This introduces a profound change. The system begins to regulate itself through information. At the same time, enforcement institutions become increasingly specialized. Roles that were once combined in earlier systems judgment, documentation, execution are now separated into distinct administrative functions. This separation increases procedural reliability, but also reinforces the abstraction of authority. No single individual holds complete visibility over the entire chain of punishment. Instead, each participant operates within a limited segment of the process, relying on records, directives, and institutional frameworks to guide action. This segmentation produces efficiency at scale, but it also creates distance between cause and effect. In physical terms, enforcement spaces continue to reflect this evolution. Older structures are replaced or reorganized into complexes designed for procedural flow rather than singular events. Movement through these spaces is increasingly linear and segmented, mirroring the administrative stages that define modernized punishment systems. What matters is not only where individuals are held or processed, but how they move through the system over time. This temporal structuring of punishment becomes increasingly important. Rather than existing as isolated moments, punishment unfolds across sequences of documentation, review, classification, decision, and execution. Each stage may occur in a different location, at a different time, and under a different authority. The result is a fragmented but coordinated system in which consequence is distributed across both space and time. In some regions, particularly those undergoing early centralization of state power, this system becomes tightly integrated with emerging legal codes. Laws are written with increasing specificity, not only about offences and penalties, but about procedures for determining guilt, verifying evidence, and applying consequences consistently. This procedural emphasis reinforces the idea that punishment is not arbitrary, but the result of structured reasoning. However, the complexity of these systems also makes them less transparent to those subject to them. For individuals within the system, understanding how a particular outcome was reached becomes increasingly difficult. The process is no longer visible as a single action, but as a chain of institutional interactions, many of which occur outside of direct observation. This opacity is not necessarily intentional in all cases, but it becomes an inherent feature of scale. As systems grow larger, they necessarily become more segmented, and as they become more segmented, they become more difficult to perceive in their entirety. This does not reduce their effectiveness. In many cases, it increases it, because when systems cannot be easily seen as a whole, they are harder to challenge, modify, or resist in coordinated ways. At the same time, the internal logic of punishment becomes more self-referential. Legal systems increasingly justify themselves through precedent, codification, and procedural consistency. Authority is no longer grounded solely in individual rulers or institutions, but in the continuity of the system itself. A decision is valid because it follows the system, and the system is valid because it produces decisions. This circular reinforcement strengthens institutional stability, Even as it further separates authority from individual perception, across different regions, variations of this model develop according to local conditions, but the underlying trajectory remains consistent, whether in centralized monarchies, emerging bureaucratic states, or hybrid systems combining older and newer forms of governance. Punishment becomes increasingly tied to information, documentation, and procedural structure. Physical enforcement remains present, but it is no longer the defining feature of the system. Instead, it becomes one component within a broader architecture of control that operates continuously through records, classifications, and institutional processes. In this architecture, the most powerful form of punishment is not always the moment of consequence itself, but the classification that makes that consequence possible. Because once a system can define individuals through records, it can also define the boundaries of what is possible for them. And once those boundaries are established, enforcement becomes less about reacting to behaviour, and more about maintaining the structure that defines behaviour in advance. At this stage, punishment is no longer simply a response to disorder. It is part of the infrastructure that determines what order means. By the time punishment becomes fully integrated into the administrative logic of expanding states, it begins to dissolve the boundary between enforcement and everyday governance. What once appeared as a distinct response to wrongdoing gradually merges into the continuous management of society itself. The system no longer waits for disruption to act. It continuously defines, monitors, and adjusts the conditions under which disruption is even possible. This is where punishment begins to function less as an event and more as a background structure. In increasingly complex early modern states, authority is expressed not only through law or enforcement, but through the ongoing maintenance of classification systems that organise populations into legible categories. These categories determine taxation, legal obligation, mobility, and access to resources. Within such a framework, deviation is not simply an act to be punished, but a misalignment within an already structured system. Correction becomes administrative rather than exceptional. This shift reflects a deeper transformation in the nature of governance. Instead of focusing primarily on visible transgressions, states begin to invest in systems that reduce uncertainty at scale. Populations are mapped, recorded, and continuously redefined through documentation that allows authority to operate without direct observation. The effect is a form of governance that is both more stable and more abstract. Stability comes from the ability to anticipate and structure behaviour in advance. Abstraction comes from the increasing distance between individuals and the mechanisms that define their legal and social position. In this environment, punishment becomes embedded within routine administrative processes that rarely appear punitive in isolation. A change in classification, a restriction on movement, a reassignment of status. These may function as consequences without resembling traditional forms of punishment, yet their effects on individuals can be equally significant. This blurring of boundaries between governance and punishment is one of the defining characteristics of highly developed administrative systems. At the same time, the physical spaces associated with enforcement continue to evolve. Instead of isolated chambers or spectacle-based arenas, punishment is increasingly managed within integrated institutional complexes. And these spaces are designed not for singular dramatic events, but for continuous procedural flow. Movement through such environments is structured, sequential, and controlled. Individuals pass through a series of stages that correspond to different administrative functions. At each stage, different forms of authority are applied: documentation, assessment, verification, decision-making, and implementation. No single stage contains the entirety of the process. This fragmentation ensures efficiency, but also reinforces the distributed nature of authority. In earlier systems, punishment could often be traced back to a visible decision-maker or a clearly identifiable institution. In these more complex systems, responsibility is dispersed across multiple layers of administration. The outcome emerges from the interaction of procedures rather than the action of a single entity. This diffusion of responsibility is not incidental. It is structurally embedded in the design of governance itself. As states grow larger and more complex, this distribution becomes necessary to maintain functionality. No individual or single institution can manage the entirety of enforcement across large populations. Delegation, specialization, and procedural segmentation become essential. But these same features also reshape how punishment is experienced. From the perspective of those subject to the system, consequences may appear less as direct acts of authority, and more as outcomes of an impersonal process. Decisions seem to arise from systems rather than individuals. This perception reinforces the idea that governance operates independently of personal discretion. Within such frameworks, legitimacy is increasingly tied to procedure rather than presence. A punishment is considered valid not because of who enforces it, but because it follows established rules. This procedural legitimacy strengthens institutional continuity, allowing systems to persist across generations of political change. Even when leadership shifts or institutions evolve, the underlying structures of enforcement remain intact. This continuity is reinforced by the increasing reliance on written records and codified law. Documentation becomes the memory of the system, preserving decisions, procedures, and classifications over time. It allows enforcement to remain consistent even as personnel and circumstances change. However, this reliance on documentation also introduces a new form of abstraction. The lived reality of individuals becomes translated into records, categories, and procedural entries. What is experienced directly is transformed into structured data within the administrative system. This transformation allows governance to scale, but it also distances authority from immediate human experience. Punishment, in this sense, becomes mediated through layers of interpretation and record-keeping. Across different regions and traditions, variations of this system continue to develop. Some emphasize legal codification and bureaucratic consistency. Others retain stronger elements of localized authority or customary practice. But the broader trajectory remains consistent, increasing reliance on systems that operate independently of direct observation. Over time, this leads to a situation where punishment is no longer easily distinguishable from governance itself. It is embedded in how populations are recorded, how identities are classified, and how access to resources is structured. It operates continuously, even in the absence of visible enforcement. This represents a profound shift from earlier historical periods. Punishment is no longer primarily an interruption in social order. It becomes one of the mechanisms through which order is continuously produced. And as this mechanism becomes more refined, it begins to shape not only behaviour, but the very framework within which behaviour is understood. At this stage, the boundary between law and structure begins to blur almost completely. What remains is a system in which consequence is no longer an external response to action. It is an internal feature of how society itself is organised and sustained. At the final stage of this long historical evolution, punishment is no longer something that can be easily isolated as a single practice, a specific space, or even a distinct institutional function. It has become woven so deeply into the architecture of governance that separating it from the broader structure of society requires a kind of abstraction that earlier civilizations would not have recognized. What began as immediate reaction to disorder in small human groups has, across millennia, transformed into a layered system of law, administration, documentation, and perception. Each layer developed in response to the limits of the one before it. When visibility was no longer enough, structure emerged. When structure was not sufficient, bureaucracy expanded. When bureaucracy reached its limits, psychological and informational systems evolved to extend control further still. At every stage, punishment adapted not by disappearing but by changing its form. In the most developed versions of early modern governance, punishment is almost indistinguishable from regulation. Laws define categories of behaviour so precisely that deviation becomes a matter of classification as much as action. Administrative systems continuously update the position of individuals within these categories. Enforcement, when it occurs, often appears as the final expression of processes that have been unfolding quietly for a long time. This creates a system in which consequence is distributed across time. An individual action may not immediately result in visible punishment. Instead, it may initiate a sequence of administrative responses, each one embedded in documentation, procedure, and institutional review. By the time a final outcome appears, it is often the endpoint of a process that has already reshaped status, access, and opportunity in less visible ways. In this sense, punishment becomes cumulative rather than singular. At the same time, the physical infrastructure associated with enforcement reflects this deep integration. Spaces are no longer designed primarily for spectacle or isolated containment. Instead, they function as nodes within larger systems of administrative flow. Movement through these spaces is structured by procedure, not by isolated events. Each stage connects to another, forming a continuous chain of governance. Within this chain, no single point holds the entire meaning of punishment. Instead, meaning emerges from the sequence itself. This is one of the most important transformations in the history of human governance, the shift from discrete acts of enforcement to continuous systems of regulation. It is a shift that makes punishment less visible, but more pervasive, less dramatic, but more enduring. Even in societies that begin to question or reform earlier punitive practices, the underlying structures often remain in modified form. Legal systems evolve, but the reliance on classification, documentation, and procedural control persists. The language of law may change, but the architecture of governance continues to operate through similar principles. This continuity explains why traces of ancient enforcement systems can still be detected in modern institutional frameworks, not in their physical forms, but in their logic, the idea that order is maintained through structured consequence, and that behaviour can be shaped through systems that operate beyond immediate perception. Across this long arc, one pattern remains constant. Punishment is always tied to the organisation of society itself. It reflects not only what a civilization prohibits, but how it understands order, stability, and human behaviour. In early societies, this understanding is direct and physical. In later systems, it becomes abstract, distributed, and embedded in layers of administration and perception. Yet the underlying function remains recognisable across time, the maintenance of coherence within complex human systems. As this narrative reaches its final stage, what becomes clear is that punishment cannot be understood in isolation from the societies that create it. It evolves alongside them, shaped by their needs, their structures, and their limits. Each transformation in governance produces a corresponding transformation in how consequence is defined and applied. And as societies continue to grow in complexity, the mechanisms of control grow with them, becoming less visible but more deeply integrated into the fabric of everyday life. In the end, punishment is not simply a tool used by civilizations. It is one of the ways civilizations define themselves, not as a single act, not as a single institution, but as a continuous structure through which order is maintained, adapted, and preserved across time. And when viewed across the full span of history, from the earliest stone chambers to the most complex administrative systems, one truth becomes difficult to ignore. Punishment does not stand outside civilization. It grows with it, shapes it, and becomes inseparable from its very form. The weight of this history does not end where institutions become efficient or where law becomes structured. It lingers in a quieter way, in the background of how societies still organize consequence, even when the language has changed and the architecture has been rebuilt. Across time, what remains consistent is not the shape of punishment, but the need for order within complexity. Early communities held that order in memory and immediate reaction. Later civilizations held it in stone, in law codes, in bureaucratic records, and finally in systems so distributed that no single person could fully see them at once. Each stage made life more stable in certain ways, but also more distant from the original human scale where cause and consequence were closely linked in space and time. Standing back from this long arc, it becomes clear that punishment was never just about pain or deterrence. It was a language through which societies expressed their boundaries. What could not be accepted was defined, recorded, and eventually integrated into systems that ensured repetition of those boundaries across generations. Even when enforcement softened or became more abstract, the structure beneath it remained intact, shifting form rather than disappearing. In the ruins of ancient chambers, in the fragments of legal tablets, in the layered walls of administrative buildings, and in the complex records of later states, there is a shared continuity. It is not a continuity of method, but of intention, the attempt to manage human behavior at scale without losing coherence. Each civilization solved this problem differently, yet each solution carried forward elements of the ones before it. Over time, the most profound change is not the disappearance of visible punishment, but its redistribution into systems that operate continuously, often without drawing attention to themselves. What was once an event becomes a process. What was once a moment becomes a structure. And what was once clearly external begins to merge with the internal logic of how societies define normality itself. Even in the modern imagination, echoes of these earlier systems remain, not in their physical forms, but in the underlying idea that order requires consequence, and that consequence must be organized in a way that scales with complexity. The language may now be legal, administrative, or institutional rather than physical or ritual, but the structural need it addresses is unchanged. What history ultimately reveals is not a straight line of increasing severity or refinement, but a continuous adaptation to the challenge of organizing human life in groups that grow larger, denser, and more interconnected over time. Punishment, in all its forms, becomes one of the tools through which that adaptation is expressed. And as this long trajectory settles into memory, what remains is not a single image or moment, but a slow recognition that systems of consequence are always tied to the shape of the world that produces them. When those worlds change, the systems change with them, but they never fully leave. They only transform and continue.